presentation is every time you open your mouth. Because actually you're always trying to make an impression on people. So every time you open your mouth, you're making a presentation, whether it's one-to-one, whether it's in a meeting, whether you're standing up to make a formal presentation, even when you're making a telephone call. You achieve good rapport by making sure that you actually look people in the eye. The eye contact is very, very important, and it's really important for the audience to know that you are talking specifically to them. And a lot of bad presenters don't do that. They're afraid of looking the audience in the eye. They get distracted. But for me, building rapport is making sure that everybody knows you're talking to them. And another way of building rapport is making sure that your body language is open and expressive. A lot of presenters actually stand there and they look as though they've sucked on a lemon and nothing moves whatsoever. And in fact, you build rapport by opening yourself up and making the audience feel part of what it is that you're saying. I believe when you're speaking to people, you want to try and sound as natural as you possibly can. So you get excited and you run away with the excitement of something. And then you have to pause and hold things back and become reflective and use your voice for the audience, because that's what keeps the audience's interest together with the body, is using that voice as an instrument. I also think people get afraid of using silence. I always say to people when they stand up to speak, I want you to give yourself permission to say nothing. Because when you stand up in front of an audience, you get frightened and petrified. And so we tend to gabble on, and we gabble on all on one level, and we bore the audience stupid by actually doing that. So we need to have lovely silences and lovely pauses, because actually that gives the audience then the opportunity to take on board what it is we're saying and to think through what we've just said and to get ready for our next point. And if we want to make our voices more powerful, a lot of people I work with hate their voices. They always say to me, Judith, I hate my voice. And is there anything I can do about it? And little tips I give to people, I say, have you got any children? And very often people say they do. I say one really good piece of advice is, go and read a story to your children, close the door to their bedroom and really act out the characters. Your children will love it, and you will actually hear what it is that your voice is capable of doing. In our society, eye contact is absolutely essential. And I believe you have to look people in the whites of their eyes, because if you don't, they'll say horrible things about you. Shifty, lying, insecure, timid, cold, arrogant, aloof, knows it all. So it's really important to use your eyes, and not just to look at one person. That's another mistake people do. They tend to look at the person who's looking really enthusiastic, and they forget to bring everybody else in that they're talking to. And I also believe it's really important to have a sparkle in your eye, and there's such an easy way of doing that. And it's something else that people forget to do. They forget to smile, because every time you smile, actually, you can probably see it now, my eyes lighten up. A lot of people that I work with actually still in this day and age come with a script, and they read from a script. You know, you think about conferences, very often what are people doing? They're standing behind great big fat podiums and reading from a script. I always say to the people, absolutely no way. Reading from a script is a total and utter audience turn off. Because actually, when you think about it, when you read from a script, it's really your comfort blanket. It makes you feel better. But actually what we need to think about is what's going to engage with the audience, not what makes me feel better. And when you read from a script, terrible things happen. For a startup, you don't even think. I mean, you're just sort of basically reading from this script. The audience get transfixed by the number of pieces of paper you've got, and all they do is watch you turn over these pieces of paper. So they're not even listening to what you're saying, they're just waiting for you to come to the last piece of paper. I also think if you use a script, there's no point in you being there anyhow, because you might as well say to the audience, I tell you what, why don't you have this script and read it on my behalf? There's actually no point in being there. So there's loads of problems with reading from scripts. When I work with a group of people, I always suggest that they use cue cards, which are small pieces of card that you can use. And I tell them, all I want you to put on those are keywords. And it takes guts to write down a keyword, because actually what you want to do is write masses on it. But actually all you need is the keyword, because if you only put down a keyword, you are forced to think. You have to think about what that keyword means. And then when you open your mouth to speak to people, you sound like a normal human being rather than a technical robot reading from a script. It's discreet. It goes really neatly into your hands. And I say to my people, be proud of them. It makes the audience know that you have worked on this presentation for them, and there is the proof of it in your hands. It also gives you something to do with your hands. And it's not a huge barricade like a script is. It goes neatly into your hand. It helps you to do work with your hands. You can have your cue cards in one hand and you can be gesticulating with the other. And the more practice you become, you can change over hands and gesticulate with the other hand. So cue cards to me actually keep you on track and they make you sound like a normal human being. There are 3 golden words that I use in order to form the structure to a presentation. And I have used these 3 words for 20 years. And this template that I personally use has never changed in 20 years. I always say to people, why reinvent the wheel? Lives are difficult enough. We're all stressed out. What we need, I think, is a template that we can use for any presentation we ever have to give. Major stand-up formal presentations, impromptu speeches, votes of thanks, introduction to a course. And the 3 words are very simple and we all know them. And that is beginning, middle and end. I tend to call them, make them sound a little bit more exotic. I call them introduction, development and conclusion. And to me, the introduction always has 3 ingredients whenever I'm making a formal presentation. The first thing I do is I make sure I start with an absolute humdinger of an attention getter, something really strong. I say to people, you've got one chance and one chance only to get it right, so make sure it's strong. And most people don't do that. They just sort of witter into it, they ramble into it, they apologise about being there in the first place, rather than having a really strong attention getter. The second thing I do in my introductions is I make sure that I appeal to the audience's needs. In other words, what's in it for you, the audience? Because if there's nothing in it for you, the audience are not going to listen to what it is you've got to say. I call this the Whiffam factor. The audience sits in their chairs and they say, what's in it for me? So you must make sure that you appeal to the audience's needs. The third thing I do in the introduction is I make sure I state the topic of the presentation. I make sure everybody knows why they've all been assembled there in those chairs to listen to me speak. And when I listen to presentations, I find all the time I listen to presenters speak for an hour or so. They sit down an hour later and I'm still not totally sure as to why they stood up in the first place anyhow. So make sure that you state the topic of the presentation, then everybody knows why they're there. The development section of a presentation, I believe it should be like a menu. This is the first course, this is the second, this is the third, this is the fourth. Let the audience know where you're going, signpost it for them. And again, I have to say, in the great majority of presentations I listen to, the presenter doesn't do that. They go from one obtuse idea to another, and to another, and then they wonder why it is that the audience gets lost. And as soon as the audience gets lost, guess what they do? They fall asleep. So there is no point in trying to make it too complicated. Make it extremely simple. So hold their hands, lead them through it. And I also use something that I called connectors. Make sure that you hold their hand and pull them from one idea to the next. So you say, so that's the first thing I wanted to talk about. Now I want to move on to the second area. Or, so that's how we used to work in the past. Now I want to talk about what's happening presently within the organisation. So signpost it and lead them through. It makes the audience feel confident. It makes the audience feel intelligent. They know where they're going and they feel so much happier. A conclusion for me has 5 ingredients. I always put these 5 ingredients in when I make formal presentations. The first thing I do is I use something very simple, and it's to say, in conclusion, or so, or finally, or to sum it all up then. Let the audience know that you're coming to the end. So I call that re-getting the audience's attention. The second thing I do in the conclusion is I re-appeal to the audience's needs. I remind them why I have been talking to them and how it's been useful for them. The third ingredient for me is I make sure I restate the topic of the presentation. Some of them might have forgotten what it is you were talking about by that stage in the game, so remind them of the topic of the presentation. The fourth ingredient I put into my conclusions is I restate the subtopics of the development. I remind them about the menu. I remind them about the stages that I went through in the development section. And then the fifth thing I do is I make sure I finish with a climax to the presentation, a high point, a call to action, a recommendation, a proposal. Most people don't do that. What they actually do is they sort of say, well, that's about it then really, and sort of fall off the end of the stage, you know, rather than making it really climactic and making the audience go out of that room on a high. When you're planning your presentation, it's really important to think about the kind of audience you're going to be speaking to as well. So it's really important to pick up the phone and find out. I had a guy I was working with not very long ago, and he was making a speech to a conference, and that's why he'd come on the course. And I said to him, good for you, Derek, you know, that's why you're here. I said, you know, how many people will actually be at the conference, Derek? He said, I don't know. And I said, and how long will your presentation be going on for? He said, I don't know. And I said, and what's the theme of the conference? He said, I don't know. And I said, and all these powerful presentation slides we're getting together for your computer, are you sure it's going to be compatible when you get into that conference room? He said, I don't know. I said, do me a favour, Derek, when this course is over, will you? Pick up the phone and find out. Find out everything you can about your audience. Your audience have a right to expect that you know what they're wanting and that you have prepared yourself for them. Visual aids is a really difficult area nowadays. I think we've gone visual aid balmy. I think we've gone PowerPoint mad. And when I talk to people about visual aids, I say to them, you are the best visual aid that there is. There is no visual aid better than you are. Why do you want to give the attention of the audience to some inanimate object when actually we know that people buy people? They look at you and they say, do I like that woman? Can I work with her? Do I trust her? Actually, they don't buy a PowerPoint presentation. But obviously visual aids are extremely important, and a lot of people work in a very visual medium, and visuals are really important. But when I look at people's visual aids, I have to say to them, you know something? Those visual aids aren't visual at all. They're verbals. They're words on a screen. And that's my job. The words are my job. That's what all this incredible equipment is here for. It's to speak to the audience. So I say to people, why don't you put on that visual what you can't say, not what you can? Graphs, statistics, flow diagrams, pie charts, processes, procedures, cartoons, photographs, things you can't say, not what you can. Make sure that they're visual, because I find that people spend hundreds and probably thousands of hours looking at the most boring array of boring words on a boring screen. So make sure that your visuals are visual and then are used with sophistication. Controlling the nerves is really vital, and I think so many people are so worried and so nervous about making presentations, and they don't get the help that they need in this area. Controlling nerves is absolutely essential, because you've got to be in control of your mind and you've got to be in control of your body before you even think about opening your mouth to stand up in front of a group of people. Because if you haven't got control of your mind and your body, then you're finished before you even stand up to speak. So when I'm working with people, I actually take them through a major relaxation session. And we actually think about all the parts that we actually need for speaking. And then I make people, we usually sit in a darkened room, I turn the lights on, I close the curtain, and these relaxation session, and I take them through each part of their body. So we start with the bottom of their toes, we come right the way up, right to the tops of their heads and all the way back down again, tensing and relaxing each part of the body that you actually need for speaking. And that's the first thing I do with people, to get them to understand where the tension is and where the relaxation is. So while they're waiting to make their presentation, they can be working on the parts of their body they know are going to cause them problems. Because if they don't work on those parts of their body, I know that those parts of their body will work on them. So it's their body and they have to take control of it. The same thing applies to the mind. I believe that you have to visualize yourself making this presentation in your mind's eye. and everything is going absolutely and utterly according to plan, you are visualizing success. You can see yourself standing up there making the presentation. You've got the audience in the palm of your hand. They're all smiling at you. You are standing up there totally professional, having a wonderful time, got the audience in the palm of your hand. You have to visualize success. As soon as you visualize failure, you know exactly what's going to happen to you. I also believe that you have to use self-assertion techniques. You have to say to yourself, I can do this presentation. I can do this presentation very, very successfully. Because as soon as you say, I'm going to make a right fool of myself here, guess what happens? So being in control of the mind and the body is absolutely essential before you even consider standing up to speak to an audience.